Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Russell. I'm here with Scott Duncan, who has, I think, from your listeners' perspective, a very interesting history and a very interesting approach to how to approach product development, software development, and so on. So, first, Scott, what is the phrase that you use to characterize yourself? That was interesting.
Various times because of the exposure I had when I worked for the Bell system. I got to meet all kinds of well-known people in the software industry back then, and also through Agile conferences. So a lot of people who are well-known, who are famous, know me, but I'm not. I'm the most well-known non-famous person in the software industry because of so many people I've met who other people would say, "Oh, I know that name. Gee, I read their papers or I read their book and stuff." But I'm not exceedingly well known as broadly as some of those folks are. And that started way back in the 1980s and has moved up to mostly the present time.
Yeah, so let's start with the bell system. If somebody's been around for a while, the bell system means something, but to most people, particularly if they're younger, it has no meaning. So, what's some
Yeah.
context that you can give them
Well,
about what is the bell system and why does that ring a bell, so to speak, with a lot of people who
well,
have been
first
around?
of all, I came out of college thinking that I was going to be a teacher. And I had a master's degree, and nobody seemed to need a master's degree in English literature very much. So I ended up where I saw an ad for a company in central New Jersey. They were opening a new office, and it turned out to be the Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company. I said, "Oh, well, they publish books. That's literature. I'll see what I can do." And they brought me in and they gave me the Iowa test of basic skills, which the company promoted. And years ago, back in the 60s and 70s, they would give this to students. It was an IQ test. And I was always good at those. And I scored ridiculously high. And they were about to hire the person he had just interviewed before me. And I walked in and aced this test. And so they hired me. 1972, they sent me to a Honeywell programming class, 2 weeks of assembly language programming. So that's how my career started. I worked for a couple of companies, but eventually I got the opportunity to go work for Bell Laboratories.
Oh, so if I could
Um,
just pause you for a second there. So, an additional bit of context. So, Honeywell, what kind of computers are we talking about that you were learning to program?
Oh, they called them the Mod 1s or something like that. These were machines that were very similar to the old IBM 1401 machines, which came before the IBM 360 line. So I was programming in a language called EasyCoder, which was a Honeywell kind of simulation of the IBM autocoder, which preceded IBM assembly language, which everybody was used to after that. So yeah, it predated what we would consider more modern mainframe computers and stuff. But I went to work for the state of New Jersey and learned IBM mainframe stuff. And then that got me into, people think of the Bell Labs as, oh, C and Unix. But it turned out that in central New Jersey, a lot of the big applications in the telephone companies were actually run on big IBM computers. And so, because of my many years of, at that point, 10 years of IBM background, I got into the Bell system in a big project that had 3 mainframe computers just to run that project. So, it was a huge project. But the advantage, of course, being in the Bell Laboratories was all kinds of famous people would be invited to come speak there. All the big names in software development back there would come. And so I got to meet all these people. So it was a wonderful place to learn things and to find out about lots of different things. And I was there for about 15 years before my family moved south for a job of my wife's and stuff. So I really appreciated that opportunity. Again, it was back right after the divestitures of the phone company. For the first 5 years, the part I was with still had all the benefits of being in the Bell system. And then even after that, as part of the Bell system, people were brought in and I got to continue to meet the people in the industry and stuff. And so that kind of continued with me. I got to go to a lot of conferences. I got to go to NASA conferences down in Greenbelt, Maryland, with the people who did the telemetry They didn't shoot off rockets and stuff, but they did telemetry from all kinds of things and got to meet those folks. And I got to travel into Europe and talk to companies about their quality practices and around the United States. Vice president of software development, the Bell system, the part I was with. I got a chance to travel around to learn from lots of different people. So I had a great opportunity to get to meet a lot of folks and talk to a lot of people, both here and in the United States, about how they did things. And that was a great benefit. But it was all waterfall. It was all your basic waterfall. And I was doing waterfall like training at certain places. But then we moved. I went to work for a company that did credit card transaction processing, and that was all waterfall. But while I was there, that's when the Agile movement started. So in 2002, a year after the Agile Manifesto, I read the first book that I'd ever read on Agile development, which was Kent Beck's Extreme Programming Explained. And I thought about that and I said, wow, there's some of the things in here that we did back before I even worked for the Bell system, back in the late 70s, early 80s, we were on a project and we had daily meetings. We shared all this information. We worked closely with our customer representative, which was our marketing director. We worked with a testing person on a regular basis. We did all these things. So we didn't exactly do pair programming, but something close to it in some cases. And we certainly had continuous integration because we could build and test anytime we wanted to in our environment. So we did a lot of stuff. And I said, gee, I really loved working on those projects. So I got really enthused about Agile development. The company I was at wasn't that interested in it. So a couple of years later, after I went to my first Agile conference, which was the early Agile development conferences, the ADC conferences, before the Agile Alliance existed, I went to the one in 2004, and it was really small. A lot of Agile conferences over the years have gotten up to 2,000, 3,000 people. But back then it was like 300, 400 people. And everybody who wrote the manifesto, almost everybody, was at those conferences. So I got to speak to the people who wrote the manifesto, ask them questions about, you really mean welcoming changing requirements? Because I never knew a program, including myself, that welcomed changes late in development. There were
Right.
some things I had to straighten out and find out what they meant by those things. But that was another great benefit. I met all those folks, and some of them I still once in a while see today, even though I don't go to the conferences much. I keep in touch with Mike Cohn. Didn't write the manifesto, but I met him. Ken Schwaber was, and Mike Cohn were my Scrum Master trainers. And so I've known Ken over the years, and Mike, and then Alistair Cockburn, Ron Jeffries, a number of people who wrote the manifesto. I've kept up with them in many ways and stuff. So that was another great opportunity to get to meet and talk to people who were really at the center of all this. And for a number of years, I've done Scrum training. I'm still willing to do that sort of thing, but I've transitioned into not being as enthusiastic about that and seeing that sometimes, especially as the Agile movement has jumped over the chasm, as they say, it's gotten into bigger organizations, and bigger organizations want to buy a solution. And so they bought into, let's train everybody in this framework and then Agile will fix our problems for us. And I've typically seen that doesn't work. So I've become less enthused about that. And about 3, 4 years ago, I wrote a book called Understanding Agile Values and Principles. And InfoQ has it up as one of their free mini books. And I think it's been downloaded about 5,500 times. So a lot of people have gotten a hold of it. It's still freely available. But I wanted to talk to people about what I thought the Agile values and principles meant. Because I would go to companies and people had been through framework training, Scrum or whatever. I only pick on Scrum because 80% plus of the people claim they do Scrum. So that's a big example. Now of course, there's SAFe, there's scaled Agile stuff. So SAFe is another big thing that people talk about. But a lot of people get trained, even have never heard of the Agile values and principles, let alone had any good training in them. And I felt that was unfortunate because I always felt that's what Agile meant. It was trying to implement those values and principles because there are lots of ways to do Agile. Over the years, I've run into about 5 different ways to estimate, multiple different ways to run all the Scrum meetings and stuff like that. So there are lots of ways to do things, but understanding why you do them seemed to me to be something that people missed out on. And that's why I've moved into what I call a no frameworks approach, trying to introduce people to Agile without first trying to teach them to behave within a certain framework, like Scrum or SAFe.
Yeah, I want to come back to that no specific framework approach. I'd like to explore just a little bit more from way of kind of a background and context perspective. Some of
Mm-hmm.
the people that you had interactions with in the past, and one thing that when you mentioned the Bell system and Bell Labs in particular, if again, from a historical perspective, back in its day, Bell Labs was equivalent to Google, Apple, or whatever. It was a tech mecca. It was one of
Yeah.
the places to be, which is why all the influence brought in people had speakers just like Google does. Starting from there up until the time of the Agile Manifesto, some of the other conferences and things, who are some of who you consider the influential people who formed your thinking today, and why did it strike you as important at the time?
I still think somebody like Barry Boehm was very important. He came up with one of the key estimation models, the Kokomo model, the cost constructive model. And he had a lot of important thinking about what he didn't call it an iterative approach. He had we called a spiral model, which was an iterative way of working your way in
Right.
big projects down. I think Tom DeMarco, who worked with the Erdens early on in a lot of software areas, Tom and some of the people he worked with talking about how to consider dealing with software developers, how to consider the kind of environment that would help them, not so much focusing on the technical practices of how to code this and how to do that, but what kind of an environment you want to build. Jerry Weinberg was another person back then who was out of
Right.
IBM and stuff. And he had similar kinds of ideas. He wrote books about the people side of software development. And Peopleware was one of the books that DeMarco was involved in writing with Tim Lister. And Tim Lister is another person I met at early conferences. There was David Parnas from Canada, who had a lot of really interesting early papers that I read on his way of thinking about design and structuring projects. And then Victor Basili from the University of Maryland, and some of the work he did with Craig Larman ended up writing things about agile development and iterative development. And he and Victor Basili wrote a very interesting article in Agile Computer about the history of iterative development and how it went all the way back into the 50s, that even the waterfall that Winston Royce talked about in his paper on large software development projects, even though he talked about it, people were always doing iterative work because they realized they just couldn't plan everything up front. And that's one of the things over the years that struck me more interested in a more iterative way of working was, yeah, I was steeped in waterfall and stuff, but there always seemed to be these problems. And the problems usually arose from the fact that stuff changed. And in a certain sense, the idea of waterfall was to restrict change. Think of everything up front. Try to prevent change. Try not to be distracted from exactly what we planned up front. And it seemed to me that a lot of the people I was talking about would talk about the fact that it was unfair to assume that anybody in a complex environment like software development would be could think of everything up front so that you didn't have to allow for change. And very often the changes, people would put off admitting to the change until later in the life cycle. And that just meant it became harder, more difficult, even more costly, even more dangerous, more risky to make the change that late. And so the ideas of the agile ideas I started to run into when I read that first book and went to my first conference just seemed to make so much sense. And like I said, I'd worked on a small project where that's the way we worked. And we finished the project 2 months ahead of the schedule. And so we added more functionality that thrilled our customers for this company. And we got tremendous feedback from the customers. And it just seemed like this made a lot of sense as a way to work. Now, of course, there are environments, very large government and corporate environments where, because of the structure and a lot of the regulations, if you're in a regulated industry, some stuff is more difficult to do. But it just seemed like agile ideas could work in almost any environment. You might not be able to implement a full agile process, but some of the ideas about interaction were important. And that's what led me again to this idea of let's not think about frameworks and practices right away. Let's think about how we want to structure interactions among people and what that could mean and what an organization would have to consider in changing the way they work in order to do those things. And so that's what led me to this idea of, even after many years, more than a decade of happily teaching people Scrum and being a Scrum master and coaching people
Right.
and trying to do that successfully using some of these other things that were floating around in my head. I'll do training for people if they want Scrum training, but what I try to promote to people is this: let's get into Agile without thinking about the framework first. And then maybe it'll make sense to pick on something like Scrum, but only after you've understood what it is that Agile is trying to accomplish to start with. And then we can start figuring out what the practices ought to be that help you the most.
Okay, so let's go now that you provided some of that background and some of the names and why, or at least things that people can look up if they want to go back into some of those antecedents, if you will, of Agile. What's your starting point now? So if you're doing your training, right, if I'm taking people who don't know much about Agile and I'm not going to use a specific framework like Scrum or DAD or SAFe or whatever as a starting point, what's your thinking process? What are the things that you want them to go through, or just what's your mental approach to that? Let's go ahead and get into that.
Yeah. So basically, I try to introduce the Agile values and the principles. And one by one, we talk about them. I ask people to consider, what would it take in your organization to implement this idea? What does individuals and interactions over processes and tools, the first value, what does that mean to you? What do you think would have to happen in your organization if you began to prefer the effectiveness of individuals and their interactions over a focus on the processes and tools they use? Not that the latter are unimportant, and the manifesto says they're important things, but how would a focus on the individuals and interactions have to change the way you perhaps do things or think about things? And I step through each one of the values and each one of the principles. And at the end, people almost have a plan for organizational change to begin the transformation or the change in their organization. We need to do these things if we think we want to make Agile successful. Now, in the course of talking about those, of course, I offer them ideas when they say, how would we do this? I would suggest different ways that they could estimate, different ways. We could talk about the practices, but I want them to focus on why it is they should be doing these things and how this would affect their organization. And actually, the first three things I talk to people about, and I do this in regular leadership management training, is forget about frameworks, forget about practices, forget about everything. Look at three things in your organization and consider how well they are done and what you would need to do to make them work better. And if you could do those three things, it would probably significantly change how your organization works. And then you'd begin to see people changing about how they like to behave, different practices. And there are three simple things. One of them is, how well do the people in your organization communicate with one another? Within teams, between teams and management, between the organization and their customers, internal or external. What could you do to improve the communication in your organization? And the next one, it would be collaboration. What could you do to improve how people work together effectively, how they share work, how they're willing to share things with one another, how they're willing to adopt a servant leadership attitude, which would be, what can I do to help the other people I work with be successful? How can I help others be successful? Not just,
That's how you
like my,
define servant leadership, just to make it clear. Yep.
yeah, my idea of a servant leader is a person who looks around at the people that they work with, work for them, work for all the people they interact with and say, what can I do to make these other people successful?
Okay.
And I think if an organization builds a servant leadership mentality and everybody starts to think that way, then you get the old rising tide lifts all boats. Everybody gets better. Everybody gets help to become better because everybody's trying to help everybody become better. And that's a very strong collaborative approach. And then the third thing is trust. How well do people trust one another? What are the evidences of strong trust or strong distrust in your organization? And in a sense, the fifth Agile principle kind of hints at all three of those. It talks about having motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. So that motivation I think of as an element of communication. Give them the environment and support they need. That will help them to collaborate well, and then trust them to get the job done. And I feel that if you can do those things, you'll be able to see where changes need to be made in the organization. So I start with those, and then we move into the values and principles to be a little bit specific about the Agile way about thinking of them. And I also point out to people that those three things, you really have to do all of them to make any one of them become really successful. You can't communicate effectively with people if you can't work with them effectively and you don't trust them. You can't work with people effectively if you can't communicate with them effectively and you don't trust them. And you can't trust people if you don't communicate with them well and can't work with them effectively. So you need all three of those things. And it's the simplest thing. They're the simplest things I can think of that I try to focus a group on to consider how they could improve their working environment. So I don't say, yeah, give up Waterfall, adopt Safe, adopt Scrum, do this, do that. I say,
Right.
look at these cultural things and begin to change your culture. And then if people want an agile model, I like to bring up Alistair Cockburn's. I think Alistair Cockburn, there are several people that I really like in the agile movement, but Alistair Cockburn, since the first interactions I've ever had with him, up until everything he seems to do that I find out about, seems to be the person that inspires me the most in terms of how to think about what agility means and how to convey that to people. And his heart of agile, as he says, it's so simple. Collaborate, deliver, inspect, reflect, and improve. Just four things. And I like what he says, you don't need a lot of training to understand whether you're doing that or not. People know
Yeah.
if they're collaborating, they know if they're delivering, they know if they're reflecting, they know if they're improving. It doesn't take a lot of training. It doesn't take a lot of training to focus on communicate, collaborate, and trust. And so I think those three things and Alistair's Heart of Agile are really simple things to get people involved with, to get them to think about what it means to try to implement agility. And I've focused a lot more now on implementing agility than just implementing on Agile with a big A. Although I have nothing against it because I love the manifesto, and that's Agile with a big A to me, is what the manifesto values and principles talk about. But I like to focus people on what they think agility might mean and start where you are. The Kanban approach, start where you are. I like when I teach Kanban, one of the things I try to do is contrast Kanban with an agile approach like Scrum. Again, not to criticize Scrum, but it's the big example that everybody knows.
Right.
Scrum says on Friday, if you decide you want to start doing Agile, doing Scrum, then on Monday, you have to start thinking about, oh, we need Scrum Masters. We have to identify product owners. Oh, we got to do planning meetings and daily stand-ups. And oh, and by the way, stand-ups never was in Scrum. It came from the extreme programming people. They told you how to stand up. The early Scrum book said the Scrum Master organizes the chairs, assuming you could sit down. But the retrospective and the sprint review, and then you have to have backlogs. And then, of course, things that Scrum never talked about, but did come from extreme programming that people bring in, stories and story points and a lot of practices, all that kind of stuff kind of floats in. And so I try to contrast that. There's a lot of change on Monday if you want to start doing Agile. Kanban basically says on Monday, you do the same stuff you were doing on Friday. No new titles, no new process. The only thing you commit to is continuous incremental change. And you look around and say, what do we have to change to be better? And bit by bit, you change things. And I think for a lot of people, that's less challenging and less demanding than saying, oh, we got to have new titles, we got to have four new ceremonies, you got to have backlogs, you got to do this, you got to do that. And I think people can more easily accept the idea of incremental change at their pace, as long as they're committed to doing that. They have to be committed to that incremental. Let's look around and see what the next best thing we could do is. And I think that's a very important aspect of agility, is that incremental change. How can we get better day after day, week after week? So when I do my training, I like to contrast those two. And so I take a Kanban approach to people that don't say, oh, you got to do all these new things, but look around and figure out how communication, collaboration, and trust could impact your organization. And then we can talk about values and principles after that.
Yeah. So when you talk about the three key things, communication, collaboration, and trust, what do you find that people think or identify as their biggest obstacles to doing that? Because those three factors really, as you said before, are not Agile specific, they're organizational function specific. What things come up and how can people get around them if they're trying to think, okay, if I just focus on what Scott's saying here, how do we improve communication, collaboration, and trust? What are the kind of obstacles that people usually come up against?
Like I say, since they all have to fit together, one of the obstacles is getting people to just move on one of those, because there is hesitation, there is a little bit of trust. The Agile daily meetings ask people to be open about what they're doing, not to hide things from one another. And so if you're going to communicate and collaborate and trust one another, you have to become a little bit more comfortable about opening yourself up to other people. And so it has to happen bit by bit. That's why it doesn't happen like automatically, why it takes teams quite a while to do that, because trust just doesn't happen. We want to trust people. We don't want to say we don't trust people, but it's hard to trust people if you haven't had strong positive interactions with them. You can't just stick a group of people together and say, act professionally with trust. That just doesn't happen that way. You have to get to know one another. You have to understand what works and doesn't work with one another. So you have to have that openness. And I think the biggest problem with doing any of those three, and like I said, you have to really do all three of them together, is the sense of getting people comfortable with being open to more effective communication, being open to admitting you're wrong. Very often, one sign of a team that's not going very well is nobody's really willing to admit when things didn't go right, when they were wrong. They point fingers at one another. It's somebody else's problem. I did my part. You failed on your part. And so there goes collaboration out the window. I'll do my part, but I'm not responsible for you. So right away, that's something I saw in Waterfall a lot. People diligently got their part done, but if other people didn't do their part, as long as it didn't keep me from getting my part done, that wasn't my problem. If the project failed, it wasn't my fault. I did my part. And so I
Mhm.
think part of the sense of collaboration is caring that what we do together is a success, not just that I did my part successfully in a performance review time. I can say, look at me, I was successful.
So, are there any favorite tactics or techniques for working on those things that you have used when coaching?
Just beginning to do things to get people comfortable talking. One activity I'd like to do, I ask people to think about teams they've been on in the past, and think about a team or teams that were really memorable because you really loved working with those people. It
Mhm.
didn't have to be a work group. It could have been a volunteer group, a church group, but you did something with a group of people and it was just great the way you worked together. And I asked people to write down, used to do this with post-it notes on a wall. Now we can do it with mural boards and virtual boards, but write down all the attributes that made that team or those teams, if there's more than one you've had that experience with, write down all those attributes. And for me, I always think about the team back in the 78 to the 80s that I mentioned when I read the first Agile book, I went, hey, we did stuff like that back then. I loved that project. And so I asked people to write all those things down. And then we collect them, see how many similarities there are, talk about them for a while. And then I do this with a new team, or sometimes with the team that's been together a while. And toward the end of this session, I look at them and say, now, these are the things that all of you feel make a team wonderful and memorable. My challenge to you as a new team or as your current team going forward is, what will you do to make all of these things true on your current team? How will you make this team the most memorable team you've ever been on? So that 5 years from now, if somebody asks you to do this exercise again, you're going to remember this team. And I've always found that has a powerful effect on teams because all the ideas came from them. And so they have a bunch of ideas right away about things they agree make a team wonderful. And the issue is, how do you think we could accomplish that? And I've had Scrum Masters at the beginning of their, if you use the Scrum example, Scrum Masters at the beginning of each retrospective, one of their first questions is, how do you think we've done this last iteration to become a memorable team? Before we even talk about the specific things that happened during the iteration, what have we done to become memorable?
That's
So a
a
way to
great
kind of
question.
kick off the discussion and stuff. But all the ideas come from them. I don't tell them what they ought to think. I just say, if you think this makes a team memorable and wonderful, wouldn't you a wonderful team now? So how can you do all these things? And so that's one way I get them to talk, opens up communication, collaboration, trust. They naturally think about how they'd have to do some of those things in order to make a team wonderful, because those teams did communicate well. They did collaborate well. They did trust one another. They did all those things, and they know how those things happened. And so they can talk about how we can make them happen. I don't have to tell them how to do it. Like Alistair says, they don't need training on how to do that. They've had the experience. They just need to be encouraged to think about that and keep that uppermost in their mind when they're working, and how they can do that every day.
So outside of the team, or maybe inside of the team, what are some of the key organizational factors that prevent communication, collaboration, and trust, or at least work against it? What are the kinds of things that people should look for in organizations that might need change outside of the team or that influences the team?
They said outside the team, because very often I would come into an organization, the change doesn't have to happen at the team. Yeah, some changes do, but
Mhm.
very often it's the people outside the team, the leadership outside the team, that really needs to change the way they behave to allow the teams to communicate, collaborate, and trust more effectively. Management very often doesn't go to a lot of the training. Or if they do, they hear the basic Scrum training and oh, this is what we should expect of teams. But they don't get that grounding in the values and the principles. And so they very often don't think there's much for them to change. One of the criticisms people make about SAFe, and I haven't used SAFe, I can't say this out of personal experience, but many people talk about the fact that it's easy for big organizations to adopt SAFe, and management doesn't have to change anything. They keep behaving the way they've always behaved. And that may or may not be what the SAFe folks really want to have happen. But I've talked to people in other classes and they make it sound like their management keeps doing what they've always been doing because it was safe for them to do that. So I think a lot of things have to happen outside the team. People have to get people on the teams who are motivated to do the work. Give them that fifth principle. Motivated people, give them what they need. If a team says we need this to get the job done, then the answer shouldn't be, gee, I'm sorry, we can't get that for you. You'll have to get it done anyhow. And trust them to get the job done rather than micromanaging them. And micromanagement, I think, very often comes from a fear of the managers that the people above them are going to be holding them so accountable to know everything and be in charge of everything that they feel like they have to know what's going on all the time. They have to show that they're in charge, they're directing things. Because if anything doesn't go right, their management might criticize them. So we have to do what Deming talked about years and years ago in the 50s, and then in his book, Out of the Crisis in the 80s, drive out fear. And the Agile community talks about an environment that feels safe. So people won't talk, they won't collaborate, they won't trust if they don't feel like it's safe for them to do that. If they can't open up and not have people use that to their disadvantage in some fashion, or use it to criticize or humiliate them. And that's what leadership in an organization can do. Leadership can create that sense of safety in the organization.
Anything else for that you would, if you had 5 minutes, half an hour with leaders, not taking them through the training, but saying, here are the things that you need to do to enable, I'll put Agile in quotes, to succeed. So one thing is the fifth principle you talked about, empowering a team, giving them what they need to succeed. Secondly, drive out fear. Anything else that would be key for
Oh,
leaders?
make sure they have some form of retrospective going in the organization, that everybody buys into that. Some of the most admirable examples of management have been when the managers eat their own dog food. They have their own scrum teams, for example. They have their own equivalent of daily meetings. They do their own retrospectives, but they show that they're willing to follow this process and get benefit out of it. So I emphasize retrospectives a lot. I think it's a very sad sign if teams don't feel they have time to do retrospectives, or they end up hating them because nothing ever happens, nothing ever changes, or their change efforts are thwarted from that point of view. And Deming, one of the things that Deming said, that connects to the fifth principle about motivated people, Deming said, stop robbing the hourly worker of their pride in workmanship. Stop making people feel bad about the fact that they can't do things that make them feel proud about their results. And that's part of that motivated individuals. I've been asked in places to give talks about how do we motivate people in our agile teams? How do we do that? And I'll go to managers and I'll say, when you hired these people, were they demotivated? Did you hire people that really didn't want to be here? And did you really not want them around? Weren't you and they all motivated to start with? And I said, so what did you do to them? Let's not talk about how to motivate people. Let's talk to managers about how to stop demotivating people. What
Well,
do we do after a certain number of months or years that we start to have to talk about how to motivate the staff? What have we done to them that has demotivated them? And I didn't mention Deming earlier, but I should have. Deming's the root of a lot of this stuff. His 14 points of organizational change and transformation, so many of them link right up to some of the ideas in the Agile Manifesto or other management approaches. And that one of them is don't rob people of their pride and workmanship, because that will demotivate them. And that's what Daniel Pink talked about in his book on Drive. People want autonomy, they want mastery, and they want purpose. Those are intrinsic motivators for people. So how do you motivate people? Give them a sense of autonomy. Give them what Agile says. Let them figure out as a team how to do things. Support that sort of thing. Make them feel like they're learning things. They can grow, that mastery. And make sure they understand the bigger purpose, not just what's the purpose of this team to do these 47 stories by the end of the release. That's what they have to do. But what's the big purpose? Why are they there? What's the big picture? So that's another thing, autonomy, mastery, and purpose that Daniel Pink talks about. And sometimes I slip that in if it's appropriate if that sort of thing comes up. So I have several things that I could slip in depending on how the people I'm talking to respond to some of the ideas. Because I think, like Alistair says, people really know when they're doing some of these right things, but very often they're thwarted by organizational structure. And that's where leadership has to start fighting that organizational structure. And unfortunately, the organizational structure, like Pogo used to say, we've met the enemy and they is us. The organizational structure are those people in charge of the organization. They are the ones that encourage that culture. And they have to change very often more than the people that they think are supposed to change down on the teams. Yeah, Agile is for those people.
so let's say we take an agile coach, right? And I don't think it'd be Scrum Master, which is an agile coach, just
Yeah.
the generic concept of an agile coach. So you approach it in training people about agile from a no framework. Let's talk about the principles. A lot of agile training focuses on the frameworks and the tactics. So if I understand what you're saying, I not only need to know the principles if I'm going to be a coach, but I need to know some of the organizational
Sure.
factors, organizational theory, how things work together, and so on. Expand on that a little bit because I think a lot of agile coaches think I'm here to help them with this specific process. And everything you're saying is that's a little bit of it, but there's this broader range of things. So if you tick off the major things or areas or domains of knowledge an agile coach needs, what are they?
Oh, I think a really important thing, and I teach IC Agile coaching, certified
Mhm.
coaching classes. I'm certified to do that among other IC Agile courses. And the one thing that people seem to find hardest to get used to doing is actual coaching, because they very often they do mentoring, which is advice giving, and there's nothing wrong with that. But coaching is about helping other people find their way to their own solutions rather than trying to give solutions to the people, saying, oh, you've got this problem. Here's how you ought to solve that problem. And it might be a wonderful idea, but again, it reinforces the idea that they need to be told how to do things. I can sit back and let the boss, the coach, the manager, the scrum master tell me what to do. And by the way, if it doesn't work out right, hey, I just did what you told me. It wasn't my fault. And so I think a key thing for a coach to do is to learn how to be comfortable with powerful questions.
Oh, so so what you're alluding to, if I put in different terms, the distinctions that like the International Coaching Federation, other coaching bodies make between coaching on one hand, which is the end of the coachee centered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus consulting, which is I am telling you how to do it, or I am providing a solution, versus the coaching of helping them find a solution or at least generate the pull rather than the push, if I put it in those terms too.
Yeah. And in the IC Agile courses that I teach, it makes a distinction between coaching and mentoring. Doesn't have to be consulting, but mentoring is where you end up doing advice giving. And sometimes that's what
Right.
people want. I tell people start with coaching, but if people don't seem to be getting it, or if after a while I say, look, enough with the questions, I need some help, tell me what to do. Then I say, then fine, drop into mentoring. But I said, always give them options. Don't say, here's what I think you ought to do in this situation. They have no choice. You told them, here's the one thing to do. And so I usually say, give them three choices. Why not two? It's still, which one does the coach really want me to do?
I'm guessing what you want me to
Yeah,
do. Right?
give them three, because then they get to pick one. And again, it ends up being their choice. Even though it didn't come purely from asking questions, it's still, here are three ideas. Which one of these sounds good to you? What would you think you'd like to try of all these different things? What do you think would happen if you did this? So now you're back into powerful questions again, even though you've suggested three ideas. And I stick with three because four, five, now you're giving them too much to think about.
Right.
Too many things to try. Just come up with three things you think might be the best three. But it still ends up with the same goal that you have in coaching. At the end, the person you're working with, they have the choice. They make the decision, and therefore they make the commitment. And there's a level of accountability there if they decide what they want to do, not decide they're going to do what you want them to do.
That
So I
feeds
think,
back into the autonomy, mastery, and purpose too, right?
yep.
It's back into more of what's internal to the person, intrinsic, as opposed to something external or extrinsic. Okay.
And I think that's an important distinction, because a lot of organizations, even though people may feel that they understand intrinsic motivation, but a lot of the rewards in an organization are extrinsic.
Right.
Promotions, salary increases, not that these don't have any impact, but Dan Pink says at a certain level, they stop having a big impact. You've gotten to enough. People figure, oh, I'm paid enough. Now what's going to motivate me? More money isn't going to do it, maybe. People say people don't leave. I forget the whole phrase, but people leave because of the people they work with, not the work. Very often. It's,
Yeah, or one of the variation on that is people leave because of their managers or their leaders,
yeah,
and which points to the whole thing about the big issue isn't so much extrinsic motivation, but identifying and getting rid of extrinsic demotivation or
yep,
demotivators, right?
yep. And very often some of those things that start out as motivators, after a while, like Daniel Pink talks about, they become demotivators. He talks about experiments done here and in India and other places where people were given rewards, and at a certain level, the increased rewards actually produce poorer results than the lower level resort, because then people were working for the rewards, not for the intrinsic value of what they were doing, and they became more discouraged in what they were doing and
Mhm.
more focused on how do I do something to get the reward.
So let's finish here with you're updating your book. right? And
I'm writing a new one. The first one was called Understanding Agile Values and Principles.
oh, so
The
you're
new,
doing a completely new one as
yeah, the
opposed
new one's going to be called Implementing Agile Values and Principles.
to,
And it takes a no frameworks approach to, okay, here's an agile value. What is it? What does individuals' interactions over processes and tools, what might you have to do to implement that? And so I'll talk about the changes I've seen organizations try to do. Of course, it's like the that value in particular pulls in all kinds of communication, collaboration, and trust stuff. It opens the door to that. But I step through each one. I'm going to step through each one of the values, then each one of the principles, and say, what would it mean to have to implement things? What would you have to do? Does your organization currently do this? If it doesn't, how could you change it to make that happen? So it's going to be a what and why. It's not a how-to book. There'll be a little bit of how-to in there, but my goal isn't to tell people, here's how you estimate this, and here's how you run that meeting, and here's how you do this. I might offer some suggestions for where people can look up for those resources, but I'm not going to try to tell people how they ought to run the retrospective. I'm going to tell them a little bit about why they should do it and what they might look for. It would be signs that it's not working well, so we'd have to change that. But I also learned that back in the old days, people used to say, oh, we're different here when you came to them about quality practices and stuff. And of course, for some things, yeah, but you're not so different that certain things don't make sense, that you can't apply some of these ideas. This was usually the argument about why we can't have these kind of metrics here, why we can't do this kind of process here. But it is true that organizations are different. So I've become less enthused about pushing how they ought to behave before we talk about why it is they want to behave differently. And then we can talk about what might make sense for them to try. And then maybe several ways of how they can do it. 2 or 3 different ways to estimate, one of which is to really not estimate at all. Have a team focus on breaking down stories into really small pieces, and then everything gets the same estimate. I found a couple of teams that felt that they spent a lot of time on estimation meetings, story point estimation, poker
Mhm.
planning, whatever. But a couple of teams said, isn't the really important thing to break things down into small pieces so we can get them done every few days and show progress, not wait until the end of the iteration to see if we got everything done, but every few days get it done. And so they would break their bigger stories down into things every 2 or 3 days. And then if they did that, then every story got to be 2 points. That's
Right.
it. We break it down, everything gets the same number. I was talking, Chet Hendrickson was on a call like this, and I mentioned that to him, and he said, yeah, I still use the Fibonacci series, except that I stop at 1, emphasizing that idea, very small things that can be done easily and quickly, completely and accurately in just a few days or so. And then you just give everything the same. So you finesse estimation out of it altogether. Now, for some people, that's too much to even think about. But I try to emphasize the idea is to do things in small pieces, and that eventually can lead you to the idea of everything gets the same estimate. You don't spend a lot of time on estimating at all, or none. You just spend time on focusing on how do we break these down into pieces that we can effectively design, develop, and verify, and then implement. And that seems to be the better focus than estimating.
So if you're talking to a leader, right, and the leader has, for instance, multiple products that they're trying to choose between or making some kind of prioritization, how do you work with them on whether estimation is important or not? Because they're used to using estimation as part of the input to making that prioritization decision. So just expand on that just for
I
that's
talked to them about
typically where
something.
a lot of it comes from.
Yeah, I talked to them about just how successful have their estimation efforts been in the past. Do they have data that shows how accurate the estimations were, or how often those estimates had to be changed, and what impact did that have on their scheduling and their planning? And try to get a sense of from them of their view of how effectively estimation was or wasn't. And then we talk about what made it effective in this situation and not effective in that situation. And then begin to think about categorizing projects into this is the best way to do that project. Not everything suddenly has to become agile or everything suddenly has to do story points, but what makes that work in this situation, but not work in that situation? If you have government regulations and stuff, if you have to estimate everything up front in order to do business, then you have to do that. That's the reality of your business. Can we do it in a less expensive and intensive fashion? Can we get to the same results without the same kind of let's spend weeks or months doing planning and estimation and asking people to estimate in great detail, putting it all into a project plan, putting it into a tool like Microsoft Project or Primavera or Prince or something like that, and pushing the button and out comes the project plan. And the project plan says 7 months on Wednesday at 3 o'clock, here's what's going to happen. And of course, nobody in their right mind should believe that, because every project manager I've ever known changes stuff almost every week. And those things do change.
You have to. There's no way the plan would be accurate otherwise.
Yeah. And so Barry Boehm used to talk about the cone of uncertainty. And he had this diagram. Actually, it ran this way. It's hard for me
Right.
to do it this way. But he basically said at the beginning, there's a wide variety. And he says people ought to be given levels of confidence and a range of confidence. That's one of the things that people really don't want. They want a number. Tell me how long this will take. Don't give me a range. Tell me when will this get done? And I guess that's why I say I try to ask people, how successful does your data say you have been in hitting those deadlines without forcing excessive overtime onto your projects? And then
Mhm.
do you have any data that says what that overtime did to the quality of your results? Did you lose people on those projects? Did people burn out? Do people really know whether the development side, especially in order to hit those deadlines, cut corners on unit testing, cut corners on peer reviews, did everything they could to save time in the sense of hitting the deadline, but perhaps risking the quality of the project? Or take the attitude of, oh, we'll throw it over the wall and QA will catch it. That infamous, yeah, QA is responsible for quality, which is a
Right.
crazy idea.
All right. So as we wrap up here, is there anything major that we haven't covered that you would want to communicate to someone thinking about what we've talked about so far? Have we missed anything?
No, like I said, I just encourage people to take the time to sit. If you think you want to, or you think you're already doing Agile, sit down one by one, go through the values and the principles and say, what are we doing here to make these things true and effective? And go back to the communication, collaboration, and trust. But reflect on what you think you're doing. Do what Alistair says. Reflect on what you're doing and then improve what you're doing based on that reflection.
If
And do it
people
from
want,
top to bottom.
yeah, if people want to know more, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
My email address is agile SWQUAL, Agile Software Quality. So it's AGILE SWQUAL at gmail.com.
Okay. And I presume you're also on LinkedIn. They can connect with you
Yeah,
there.
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. Yeah, I'm still on all those things.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. This has
Well, thank
been
you, Mike. Thanks for
quite
giving me this
fascinating.
opportunity to vent.
Venting based on experience and wisdom is very different from just venting.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully. I've been inspired by people who vent less, but still communicate that experience. People like Alistair Cockburn, for example, and I would encourage people to go out and look at what Alistair writes about and talks about and says. I think he's very inspiring when it comes to an understanding of agility.
Right. Thanks again.
Thank you.